I really dislike the word idol worship because idol has got sort of a lot of negative connotations. I prefer to use the word Vigraha or Murti. First of all, this word caste is a Portuguese import and is a very pejorative word. I'd like to just throw it out. What we had was Varna and Jati. Varna was basically how you organize society at a given point in time.
There is an innate disgust we have with animals, and that's why we choose not to eat them, which I don't agree with. So, if you could elucidate that. And secondly, they say that the word pure vegetarian means that everything else or anyone who eats anything else is impure, and an animal is impure. So, these seem to be very weak and very vicious arguments that seem to be doing the rounds of educational institutions in the country.
Let me show the book, which is called Dharma Yoga. And I think it's a very interesting question which you asked. And to answer that question, I maybe need to step back a little bit. All of us in the Indian subcontinent, you, me, our listeners, we are actually the inheritors and custodians of a great dharmic civilization. And this is a civilization which is the oldest living civilization. It started when our ancestors, rishis, in an inspired communion with the divine, brought us the Vedas. And over the centuries, great rishis have added one layer on top of another layer to build this whole edifice, which today we call Dharma Yoga or Hinduism, or various other names, Sanatan Dharma. Now, actually, if you look at it, you can go back into history. You can look at, Rishi Valmiki, who brought us the Ramayana. Then you look at Rishi Vyas, who brought us the Mahabharata. Then you look at Buddha, you look at Mahavira, Adi Shankara. You had great Bhakti rishis, Guru Nanak. And even till today, you see great rishis coming up from this sacred soil of Dharma Bhumi of ours. So in a sense, it is our treasure, what I call our amanat, our sampatti. And we have an obligation, really, in a sense, not just to maintain it, but to strengthen it and to pass it on to our next generation. Now, this civilization retention or survival for this period did not happen simply. We had to go through a lot of traumas. Our ancestors went through major tribulations. We had first the Turkic invasions, where there was genocide, there were temples which were destroyed. Our Nalanda University, which is one of the greatest universities of the world, all those buildings were sort of all the fire, books were put on fire. So we had a lot of issues, and not just them. Then we had the Portuguese who came into the country, and then we had the Great Goan Inquisition, where a lot again happened, which was deeply negative. And then finally the British, and theirs was the most insidious part of the whole transformation, because they, spearheaded by Macaulay, said that they wanted to create a generation of Indians who are actually, while they're brown outside, actually thought and lived their lives like Englishmen. So we've had to go through all these tribulations. And mind you, during this period of time, you had other civilizations which were contemporary with us, which have all gone and got destroyed. You look at the Greek civilization, you look at the Persian civilization, the Egyptian civilization, the Mayas, Aztecs, all these civilizations have gone. So we have survived somehow. Now, it's very easy to say, okay, we have survived during this period of time. So that, if we have survived all these problems, nothing will happen. We'll continue to survive for another 1,000 years. But, that's a very dangerous fallacy. And if you look at the best example to give you is the Persian civilization. At one time, the Persian civilization, a great empire, and Zoroastrianism was at its zenith. You had, fire temples across the land. And one day, the invaders from the desert lands came, and that was the beginning of the end of that civilization. Today, there are threats which we see on the horizon in India also. With the breakup of the joint family system and greater urbanization, our Sanskriti, our stories are no longer transmitted from grandparents to grandchildren today. Nor for that matter are the temples, they've abdicated the role in transmitting culture. Similarly, our schools, for a variety of reasons, are not doing that. So what is the consequence of that? The consequence of that is our children are learning about it from the net, from random sources, from sources who necessarily are not necessarily aligned to our vision or our well wishes. So that's a very long preamble I've given you. So let me now cut to the chase and give you why I've written the book. Set against this backdrop, we want, number one, to give a very simple, basic understanding to all our youngsters about what Hinduism actually is. Second, a lot of our people have some knowledge, but here we are trying to connect the dots. Me and my co-author Anand, we're trying to connect some of the dots and bring this whole thing into a sort of narrative rather than just a odd assemblage of facts. The other one, a third reason is that today you have a lot of people who are into yogasanas, but they don't understand the spiritual context, what the basic foundations of yoga are, then you get a very half-baked really perspective on what yoga is. So I think these are, I would say, the three primary objectives which we wanted to do, and we felt that this was an opportunity for us to contribute our little bit to our civilization and pass it on to our children. Long answer, but I hope you've got a sense of why we are doing this book.
Yes, absolutely, we did. So, what is the meaning of Dharma Yoga, sir? Since you mentioned that people are more involved in yogasanas, but they don't understand the spiritual context of it.
Okay, so let's look at it. If you look at our sort of traditions, one is a geographic definition, which is what Hinduism actually means. Hinduism was a word given by the Persians and the others outside this continent to say that east of the Indus River, which is called Sindhu River, are people who are called Hindus. Now, if I look at a spiritual definition, it's really, you can call it Sanatan Dharma. I think Dharma Yoga is a more sort of apt expression. So I'm using Dharma Yoga. So it's broken up into two words, obviously. One is Dharma and the second is Yoga. So let's look at Dharma. Dharma is derived from the root word dhir, Greek, which means to hold and to preserve, protect, uphold. So as a consequence of that, what we are doing, therefore, is to say that the world is not just something which is a random consequence of events which have happened. There is a certain background to why things have happened the way they have happened. And we believe that there is a greater purpose and there is a cosmic order. That cosmic order we call Rita. And that cosmic order, again, has various laws. There are physical laws, like gravity is one example. There are chemical laws, H2 plus 2O2 is 2H2O. There are biological laws. But equally, there are spiritual laws and ethical laws. And I think what Dharma tells us is how do we uphold those spiritual and ethical laws in the best way which we can do. And in that sense, protect and preserve the cosmic order. So that's the Dharma part of it. Now let's go to the other part of it, which is the yoga. Now, yoga, as I mentioned to you, people associated very narrowly. It's not Chakrasana or Virabhadrasana. That is just one very small facet of what yoga is. Yoga is if you look at it as Ashtanga Yoga, it's really 8 steps. And it starts with what we call yam and niyam, which are don'ts and do's. And finally, the highest peak of it is what we call samadhi, it's called nirvana, it's called moksha, which is really ultimately merging with the divine. So I think Dharma Yoga, therefore, if I look at it, is merging with the divine by following the path of Dharma. And that's what we really want you to talk about and share with our listeners.
Sir, to my understanding, oftentimes if you look at the Abrahamic religions, they have words for those who are the non-believers, like pagans, infidels, or kafirs. Now, we don't use that jargon. We don't even have a concept that's close to that jargon. I think the closest we come to that is the word adharmic, which is what we call the people who will be the victims of acid rain during Kali Yuga and will be cannibals by the end of it all. So, with that, I deduce that maybe we are not a religion, maybe we are a way of life. But many people say that all religions are the same. So, what is your take on this very reductionist view?
Okay. In a sense, the word religion itself has come to us from a Western framework. And in a sense, it's a very narrow and constrictive view of what, the world is. And if you step back, the kind of crimes which have been committed in the name of religion is something which is really tragic. I mean, you have people being burnt in the stake. You had civilizations being eradicated. You look at what happened in the Americas. You look at what happened with the Spanish Inquisition. You look at what happened in our own land, where we've had to go through genocides and events like that. So, in that sense, the word religion has, over a period of time, got into a very narrow boundary, and it's me versus you, and what you talked about kafirs and heathens and all those kind of concepts. Dharma, on the other hand, doesn't believe it's a much broader and much more inclusive concept. It's much more, in a sense, it's very fluid. Those identities are not so hardlined, that you're either here my way or the highway. It's much more, fluid and evolving as we go on. That is the reason why what happened in India. Every family in the Punjab decided that one of their children would be brought up in the Sikh tradition. Similarly, you had, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who is probably considered the greatest Sikh ruler. He actually donated gold for the temple at Kashi Vishwanath. And in his will, he wanted the Kohinoor diamond to go to Jagannath Puri. Now, it's a different matter that things took a very different course, but that was his intent. Gautam Buddha is, in many traditions, viewed as an avatar of Vishnu. There is not much of a boundary between Jains and Hindus. I heard somebody in a program saying, what is Jainism? And his reply was, it's Hinduism with steroids. Now we take it as it comes. But what it really means is that there is a certain, much more inclusive concept which we have in the name of religion. So, in a sense, then the question arises, do we say that Hinduism is not a religion, but just a way of life? But I think that would be a mistake, because then you sort of undermine Hinduism or Sanatana Dharma, because then you're saying, oh, it's a way of life which can coexist. Whereas it is really, I think, in a sense, it subsumes religion. So the best way I would describe our traditions, our Hinduism and Dharma Yoga, is by calling it a meta-religion. In that sense, it is a much broader concept and a much more inclusive concept. And one of the key concepts in Hinduism, which is very unique, is what we call the sampradaya. We have many traditions, many gurus, many lineages. But we have said that all these sampradayas have a concept of syncretism, which is learning from each other and getting the best from each philosophy, and we coexist with all these philosophies. I just want to make one example, which is not really coming from our subcontinent, but which is a very great example, which is Japanese civilization. Now, this again, they followed a similar concept. The children, when they're born, they're taken to Shinto temples for their blessings. And when they die, they follow Buddhist rituals. So in a sense, when Buddhism came into Japan, it did not replace or did not compete or fight against Shintoism. What they said is that it can coexist. And we are not bound by X or Y. This whole concept of if you are X, you cannot be Y, which is where this whole kafir stuff comes. I think that is the cause of all the challenges which we've had in the world.
I think Jainism is Hinduism on steroids is going to be my valuable takeaway from that answer. But there is a lot of spiritual attachment with Hinduism. And I just wanted to ask that according to that doctrine, then, if we can call it that, what is the purpose of human existence?
So again, I think it's a concept which we have called Purushartha. So Purushartha is basically a hierarchy of 4 steps, which is basically what Hinduism is about. So it starts with Kama, which is our meeting our physical needs, food, clothing, shelter, procreation, bringing the next generation on. Then which is there among all creatures, not just necessarily human beings. Then we have Artha, which is more, I would say, about our social evolution, about our economic evolution. And that, again, I would say, while there are not that many species, we're not the only species. Even other species have social structures. That's the second one. The third one is dharma, which is really horizontal across everything, which is, like we said, our system of ethics, our system of maryada, or a code of conduct to preserve Rita of the universe. And finally, it's moksha. So I'll talk a little bit about moksha because that is very important as one of the foundational concepts of Hinduism. So if I step back again here, ours is one religion where we say that karma is and or artha equally important. As Swami Vivekananda said, if there's a hungry man who doesn't have food, all the moksha is good, but you have to start with basics. So I think it's very important we don't negate these two. We say these have to be sort of looked at, and we have to build our economic wealth. We have to build our social structures which have harmony. But thereafter, there's something bigger, and that's the concept of Brahman. Brahman is a very unique concept in our Beta religion. Brahman is something which I'd like to sort of spend a little time talking about that. Brahman is the ultimate truth, is the final cause of all effects. Everything in the world is, in a sense, a manifestation of Brahman. You can say that in a dynamic, fast-changing world where everything is, every moment, something is going out from me, going to another person, I'm breathing out carbon dioxide, somebody else is taking it. It's all major interchanges are happening. But Brahman is that constant in a very changing world. And it's something which we call the supreme consciousness, which pervades everything. It pervades inanimate objects, it pervades animate objects, it is inside you and inside me. So that's the concept of Brahman. Very simply, very basically put. Now, what happens is that whatever, for various reasons, and the reason they attribute to is Maya, which is a delusion. I won't get into the philosophy of Maya right now, because that would itself take me a long period of time. But all of us have an Atma, or a spirit, inside us. But that Atma attaches itself to the body and not to Brahman. And as a consequence of that, we are subjected to samskara, which is the concept of innumerable births and deaths, and the associated happiness, sorrows which come with it. So how do we get out of this vicious cycle of samskaras? And that is what we call moksha, or which is really about getting to one, which is what we talked about earlier as yoga, getting into one with the divine. And when we do that, not only do we get out of the cycle of births and deaths, the other very interesting thing is that we get into a situation of total happiness, happiness which you cannot look at in the world, which is called Satchitananda. So it's an elevated state of the human being, and it is what I think all of us need to get to. It's loosely called as self-actualization, but I would say moksha or yoga or nirvana are better words to express this whole concept. So I think in a very simple, rudimentary way, we've tried to explain what this is. Now, there are volumes which are written about it. We can go on and on about it. But, as far as our readers are concerned, as far as the viewers are concerned, this is really what I would call an elevator pitch, which all of us need in one sense to get to know what is the core of our tradition.
So coming into this whole spirituality thing and taking it forward as a thread, what is the Hindu concept of creation of the universe?
That's a very interesting question. And it's a very different perspective of looking at it, because we don't say that the universe was ever created. The universe has always been there. And there is a cycle which it goes through, which we will talk about as we go forward. So that cycle, we say, is called Shrishti and Pralaya. So the universe, in a sense, is in an expansionary mode and is in a contraction mode. It is perpetually in vibration. When it goes into a contraction mode, we get into Pralaya, which is really the destruction of all living creatures and the unmanifestation. It's not destruction of the world, it just becomes a small point, which we call the Bindu. So that whole universe, which is so vast and mega in scale, contracts into a little point called the Bindu. And at that point, nothing exists except Brahman, which we talked about, which is pure absolute potentiality. Then we come to the next phase, which is the expansion phase. And that expansion phase is when the world is manifested again. And there are very interesting stories around it, which bring it a certain amount of color. It says that Brahma emerges from Vishnu's navel, and then he creates what we call an organic soup called Hiranyagarbha, which is the best way I describe it, where all the proteins of the world, the living, proteins which create our DNA, they are there. And then through remembrance of name and form, it's called Nam Rupa, where you create first Brahma Rishis. Now that's a very interesting concept, because as you go to modern science today, and we talked about DNA, what is DNA? DNA is a set of instructions to bring certain proteins into the body, and then that body, goes through childhood, it goes through adulthood, maturity, and decay. It's a whole process. So in a sense, that whole process, was talked about thousands of years ago. And, there's a very interesting story which I would like to share. So we're talking about the earth, therefore, as a cyclical process. The wheel of time, of Kala Chakra, is essential to our way of looking at the world. So you're born, you die, you come back again, and that is the process of samskaras. And that happens at a micro level, which is the individual. It happens at the macro level at the universe. So a very interesting story which I want to share. And these stories in our sort of tradition are what really give us the best impact, or make these stories come real for us. So this is the story of Hanuman. With Bhagwan Shri Ram had finished his role on earth, which was to destroy Ravan, and the time had come for him now to go back to Swara. But Hanuman would not allow it, because Hanuman was so attached to Bhagwan Ram that he said, no way would I allow anybody to come near. And so Yamaraj himself was frightened. He said, how can I come here when I've got Hanuman who will stop me? So what do I do? So Bhagwan Ram dropped a ring in a small crack, and that ring went down and down and down into what is called Patal Lok, which is, for lack of a better word, deep underground. So, and then he told Hanuman, listen, my ring has fallen. Can you bring it for me? So Hanuman went down past volcanoes, fires, went down and down and down. What he thought would be a 5-minute journey seemed to be an infinite journey. He went through all those fires. Finally, he reached this place, Patal Lok, and he went into this palace. And there he saw hundreds and thousands of rings. So and then he saw one ring, and he was excited. He said, hey, that's Ram's ring. Mission accomplished. Let me get back. Then he looked, another ring. That ring looked identical. And the third ring looked, and the fourth and fifth, and so on. Every ring was identical. So he was in a quandary. Now, Patal Lok is where the Nags, snakes live. And so Vasuki, the snake, was there. And Vasuki slithered and then looked at Hanuman being perplexed and asked him, what's your problem? And Hanuman said, all these rings. So then Vasuki said, nothing surprising about it. There have been thousands of Ramas who have come, who have given it to thousands of Hanumans who have come down. And this is something which repeats itself every period of time. And, the reason why it is done. And when you go back, Ram will not be there anymore. So this is just the cyclical nature of the world. So Hanuman was shaken up, but he realized in his heart of hearts that that is true. And when he went up, he saw that Ram was not there. So that whole cyclical concept is a very different concept compared to sort of, the Big Bang theory or any other theory which is there. It, in a sense, subsumes the Big Bang theory, because when you are, the world is being manifested, there's called a sphota or explosion. So in that sense, that happens. And then you hear Om, which is the sound of creation, the cosmic sound of creation. But in a broader sense, really, this is just one part of a very, eternal cycle which goes on.
So since you used Ramayan to explain this answer, sir, Ramayan and the protagonists within it are recipients of great idol worship. However, there seems to be a criticism that Hindus worship idols of clay. And this is both external and internal within the community as well, that these rituals and this idol worship is often criticized. So, what is your view about it?
So first of all, I really dislike the word idol worship because idol has got sort of a lot of negative connotations. I prefer to use the word Vigraha or Murti. And this is a question which a lot of people have asked, and it's there in the Bhagavad Gita itself. The Bhagavad Gita says that you can worship Ishwar in any form you want, and whatever form you worship, Bhagavan Krishna says, I will make that form, relevant to you, and I will be there in that form. So you're worshiping me, irrespective of what form you take. So, but to worship in a abstract fashion is difficult for most people. When you have a form, when you have a name, it becomes much easier to worship and focus on. And that's the reason why we use a Vigraha. Now, there's another very interesting concept in a Vigraha, and which is that when you go through that, when a devotee has got devotion, humility, and real piety, Ishwar enters. We believe that Ishwar enters into that uh, Vigraha. And by the same logic, if somebody approaches who does not have that piety or does not have that feeling of devotion, then Ishwar vacates that. So it is a question of what you wish to do. And again, there's a very interesting story. So you must forgive me for sharing a lot of stories, but that's the reason why we've tried to make this whole book also interesting for people. Otherwise, you just get into metaphysics. At some point in time, it becomes very dry. So there's this story of this boy called Balala. And Balala who was a boy who was very devoted to Ganesh. So he would see any bunch of stones and he would start worshipping and praying to Ganesh there. And then his parents were very mad at him. They said, what is this going on? You come on the road, you see some stones, you start worshipping them. How can you do that? Ganesh is not in these stones. But the boy kept insisting. So one day things came to such a pass that the parents were really mad at the child. But the child said, no, Ganesh is there. All of a sudden, they heard a big rumbling sound, and all the stones fused into a remarkable vigor, the lights flashing, and there was a remarkable vigor of Ganesh. And the parents were shaken up. Where the message of that really is, it doesn't matter what form or what shape you worship Ishwar in. Ishwar makes that form real for you. And that's really the deeper meaning of that story. And in that sense, there's another very interesting facet which I'd like to sort of bring out. It's not just about what you worship, it's also what it brings inside you. When we worship a divinity, there are certain facets or there are certain qualities which we are really worshipping, which we are admiring. Now, Ishwar in his benevolence has given us all those qualities. And when we are worshipping, we are awakening those qualities within us. So that, in a sense, is what worship is all about. It's not just about an external entity, it's about what it does to us as our internal entity, where self divinity sits inside us as our temple. So that's really a bit of a sense of how we see Vigraha worship.
Another question that comes to my mind, sir, is that we often talk about the char purusharth, artha, kama, dharma, artha, kam, moksha. So let's talk a little bit more about artha. What is the Hindu concept of wealth?
So that's a good question. And I think, like everybody else, I think if I look at wealth, there are many different facets of wealth. Wealth is not just wealth is money, wealth is material, it is your gold and your jewelry and your rupees, and that is where we worship Lakshmi. Wealth was also historically being cattle. Cattle has been the wealth of as a pastoral society. And those are cattle which give milk to our children and allow them to grow up. So that's where we worship Kamadhenu. Wealth is food, where we worship Annapurna Devi. Wealth is knowledge. And you're seeing that more and more in today's age, where we're talking about the information age and where wealth is really coming from your knowledge. And that is where we worship Saraswati. Wealth is reputation, it's brand. We talk about brand management, which is very important, but that which generates wealth. So the best brand I can think of is Maryada Shri Ram, who said, that in order to preserve the name of the Raghuvanshi dynasty, I'm willing to go to the forest just to keep, the promise which my father has made. So that Maryada of Sri Ram, that is also wealth. Each of us have a name to preserve. Wealth is environment, and that's very critical. I mean, we always worship Bhudevi. One of the key concepts in our dharmic system is that we have to live in harmony with the environment. We cannot live with the environment as a tool to be exploited, as a tool to be extracted. When you're having an extractive orientation, then obviously then you're depleting your wealth, not adding to your wealth or accreting to your wealth, which is what now people are beginning to realize, what we realized at long many thousand years ago, that living in harmony with nature is probably very, very critical. Wealth is strength. Without strength in this world, you have a challenge. I mean, and Hindu society has learned that to its cost. That is where we worship Hanuman. Wealth is power. There are multiple facets where we worship Durga. And most importantly, wealth is health. And we worship Shitla Devi. And in a sense, wealth is love. I think that's also very important. When we look at Radha Krishna and we worship them in synchrony, you go anywhere from morning walk, they will say Radha Krishna, Radha Krishna. So that is really because love is important. And love not just as, love between a man and a woman, you have love as a parent. In our society, Shravan Kumar, who took his parents on a pilgrimage, carrying them on, is held in very high esteem and regard. And as children also, when we worship Ayyappa. So I would say wealth is not just one sort of little bit. It is a whole gamut of, facets of wealth, which I think in our society, we really look at as worshipping. And that's one reason why when you are looking at Ishwar, and, I should talk a little bit about what is Nirgun Brahman and what is Sagun Brahman in this context is very important. So Brahman we have talked about earlier as the ultimate truth. Now Brahman has two facets, if I can look at it. One is called Nirgun Brahman. Nirgun Brahman is Brahman beyond, you cannot characterize Brahman without any attributes, Brahman without any, description. So when you look at Brahman without description, and the philosophy there is what is boundless and limitless? How can you bind it by talking about it? But obviously, when we're talking about Nirgun Brahman, it's very difficult. We talked about worship of a Vigraha or earlier. It's very difficult to worship. So therefore, in his, shall we say, generosity and in his grace, in his grace, he decided that he would come as Sagun Brahman, which is Brahman with all the attributes. And that is why we see Brahman in many attributes. And when I'm talking about these attributes, whether it's health or wealth or others, and different forms, Nam Rupa, which we talk about, or name and form, this is where the whole Brahman concept as Sagun Brahman comes. And the interesting thing is that there's no value judgment that Nirgun Brahman is superior to Sagun Brahman. Both these are different ways of looking at the same, entity of Brahman. And what is very interesting in this context is that the best example we can give is we look at water and ice. Water, in a sense, is formless. It takes whatever shape. But when you put it in a mold, you get all kinds of different shapes. Similarly, you look at when you're playing a flute, air is coming in, and then air is coming out through those holes in the flute. But same air at the end of the day. But it is creating melodies which are beautiful and infinite. So similarly, Nirgun Brahman has come out with infinite melodies in Sagun Brahman. And that is where we say that, this whole concept of wealth, and wealth is essentially a shortcut for really everything which is important and valuable in our lives. And that is where it becomes, it all falls into place. So one of the things which I talked about earlier was how do you connect the dots? And I think this is a vast ocean. And we have tried in our own humble way to see how we can connect these dots to make it something which people can resonate with.
That is great. So let us talk about the current expressions, practices, and controversy surrounding the Hindu practices. One thing that comes to my mind is that oftentimes we are laughed at for taking a dip in the Ganga and saying that it washes all our sins away. Another thing is that while we may define ourselves as a secular country, or we may say that there is space for everyone, and the constitution dictates what the essence of the country is. The truth is that Hinduism has a lot to do with the cultural essence and the togetherness that it brings within the communities that are native to this land. So is it true that having a dip in the Ganga washes all our sins away? And if so, then such religious rivers like the Ganga and the Yamuna that are often used around festivals to take a dip in, them being still dirty, and the governments, especially that of Kejriwal, being unanswerable to this. So what would be your take be overall on this?
So let me come first to the first point, which is what you're talking about in terms of whether taking a dip in the Ganga will wash all your sins away. Okay? And there I'd like to make a distinction between tokenism and symbolism. Tokenism is just a tick mark. You go there, you as a token, you dip yourself in the Ganga, you wash your hands after that, and you say, all my sins are washed away. That's what I call tokenism. Symbolism is when you are really there with all your heart. You're there 100% in it. Okay, you've committed sins, but you're really repentant on those sins. You feel that what I've done was wrong, and you believe, therefore, that when you're coming in there, you're doing it with with the dedication that I will follow dharma. I've got prayashchit, which is that I will whatever I've done wrong. Now I will really try and get that out from my system. That's symbolism. And again, like everything else, let me weave a story in. And there's no better story than Shiv. Bhagwan Shiva is associated, this is his land. Kashi Vishwanath on the banks of the Ganga is, all about him. And so he was there once in his land with Parvati, and he saw all these people, hundreds of them trying to, take a dip in the Ganga. And Parvati asked, what is this? All these people, are they, going to get moksha by the time they dip themselves in the Ganga? So Shiva laughed and he said, let me now play a little bit of a game. So he dressed himself as a leper. And, he had sores and cankers all around his body. And then he went and asked person, where is the banks of the river? Where can I go and where's the river exactly? So that person recoiled. He went to various people, and everybody, the moment they saw him, they sort of walked away from him. Until he finally met one person who said, listen, I will take you with me. I know you're handicapped. Let me help you. And took him to the steps of the river. Now, he said to Parvati, this is the true person who is really, there it is not about tokenism. It's essentially about being fully 110% following a follower of dharma. And he brought his chariot to take him to Swarga and gave him moksha. And all the others had to go through that whole cycle once again in terms of their life. Now, the tragedy of our current state is that we have forgotten these stories in our tradition. At one time, the Ganga was pure. Then, I think, at the time the British came, all the sewage outlets were connected to the Ganga. Then the leather industry came, and the tanneries came, and they started polluting. And all of us had a high tolerance. And it is not about one government or second government. I don't want to get into that. But it is essentially that whole mindset कि सब कुछ चलता है. And nature can be abused. When you abuse nature, there's a price you pay for it. So today, we're now making steps. We've made a few steps. There's a long way to go. But I think essentially we really need to get our, rivers in. And there is a beautiful phrase somewhere in the Vedas that whoever pollutes the rivers is somebody who is really committing one of the greatest sins. And all this is there as a part of our heritage. But like I was telling you, we have forgotten all that heritage. And many of us just blindly follow that whole concept that our nature is meant to be exploited. Let's do whatever we want in terms of nature. Nature will bear everything. And mind you, there are stories again in our past where nature rebelled against what was happening. And nature ran away and hid under the oceans. And when you're talking about global warming and the oceans rising. These are stories which are there in our history. And if we don't learn from them, there's a saying that those who don't learn from history, they are condemned to repeat it. And that is something which, unless we realize it, these things are going to hit us sooner rather than later, and we're going to have a great, great problem.
Very true. Quite similar to that, terms like Brahminical patriarchy are flung at us quite a lot. So, is the caste system integral to Hinduism? And is Hinduism the same as Brahmanism?
Oh, another, okay, you got me on some of my favorite topics again. But if I look at it now, first of all, this word caste is a Portuguese import and is a very pejorative word. I'd like to just throw it out. What we had was Varna and Jati. Varna was basically how you organize society at a given point in time. So you had four broad roles. One was the role of Brahmins, who were the custodians of knowledge. The second were Kshatriyas, who ran the government and the military. Vaishyas were businessmen who brought wealth. And Shudras were the numbers, the demography of the country. Now, the interesting thing in that concept was that power was equally distributed in society. Brahmins had knowledge, but they didn't have any military power, and they were poor. They were among the poorest of the poor. Brahmins were supposed to get, beg for their meals. They never used to get, they're not supposed to acquire wealth. The Kshatriyas had wealth, but they worked under the guidance of the Brahmins. Whether you look at even the Pandavas and all of them had a Brahmin Rishi who worked with them. Then the Vaishyas had wealth, but they did not have power or knowledge. And the Shudras had the large numbers. And, let us not forget one thing, that demography is destiny. If you don't have the numbers, you're going to face a declining situation, which is what I talked about the Portuguese civilization earlier. Now, this is just at that point in time, a particular system. But that system was not a rigid system. It was not, again, hardwired, that things could not change. And there was no hierarchy. That is as far as the Varna system is concerned. And, you had people like Parshuram, Rishi Parshuram. He was a Brahmin, but he was engaged perennially in wars with the Kshatriyas, because the Kshatriyas at that time were committing a lot of injustice. Vyasa was the son of a fisher woman, but he composed one of the greatest epics in our tradition. Similarly, his children were Pandu and Dhritarashtra, who were Kshatriyas. So all in all, we had people who went through these. And Bhagwan Shri Krishna was from the Yadav community. Today's, in peculiar, identity politics which we have, he would be called an OBC. No, we worshipped Bhagwan Krishna. We did not think of him as anything which was like, any divine function who was categorized. But somewhere, I think that was there. And then we had the Jati system. The Jati system was more, I would say, communities, often around professions. In those days, a lot of the professional, training was imparted from father to son. So they were like oilers, they were potters, they were those kind of things. Somewhere when the British census started happening, they started to try and fix these people in different buckets. And then over a period of time, I think also, I don't think we can only blame the British. We also have to take a blame that it became very rigid and hierarchical. And in a sense, people who had vested interest wanted to preserve the status quo. Now, this does not mean that our religion sanctioned this. Again, very interesting story around Kanaka. Kanaka was a devotee of Krishna, and he went to a temple in Udupi, and he wanted to go inside the temple and pray. But what happened? The people inside would not let him come inside. So what did Bhagwan Krishna do? There was a massive rumbling and the outer walls crumbled. He changed his direction, and there was a crack where Kanaka could see Bhagwan Krishna and get the darshan. All the priests were shaken up. What is happening? And I think the message was very clear. Similarly, there's a whole story in the Mahabharata about Rishi Utanka, who was a great friend of Krishna, and he said, talked to him and said, I want to get moksha, I want to, get out of this cycle of life and death. And so he was one day in the desert, and he was very thirsty. And the Chandala, which is a particular tribe, came who used to give water, the Jati. They came with a big leather, container of water. And this Rishi recoiled. I am not going to drink water from you. And then all of a sudden, the Rishi changed, and Indra was there, and Krishna was there. And Krishna said, I wanted to give you moksha. He was giving you Amrit, but you refused it, and you have to pay the consequence. So, in that, the reality, therefore, is that, divinity did not sanction this. It was a human structure. And it's a very important thing for us to understand today that if you are not, if I told you about demography is destiny, and if more and more people get out of the faith because they are seen as a subcaste or a lower caste, finally that would tell on the religion and Dharma Yoga itself. And this is what you see which has happened in Kashmir today. And the Kashmiri Pandits were finally driven out because demographically they became a very tiny part of that whole society. And these were people who were the flower of our civilization. Really, in Kashmir, they played a very big role in how our civilization evolved. But today it's a sad situation where nobody is there. So, and one last point I want to make here is that people often use Brahmanism as a proxy to attack Hinduism. Okay, it's not politically correct to say, okay, Hinduism is this X or Y, but it's all supposed to be legitimate to use Brahmanism. Today, Brahmins are a very tiny minority in this country. And, they're very rarely that you can start saying that these are the people who are causing issues. But it's easy having a whipping boy. And a lot of people have bought into that narrative. And I think, and some of us have bought into the counter narrative that, we are like, upper and somebody else is lower. And the only point I would make is that, yes, you had a Varna system at a point in time, you had a Jati system. Things change. We are not bound to any book. We are not bound to any sort of, ethical, something which is written at a point in time. Bhagwan Krishna himself said, use your judgment, decide what is best for you. And we must use our judgment today and realize that this whole system, what it can play into the hands of people who wish to undermine Dharma Yoga or Sanatan Dharma.
Very true. There was a very recent controversy that took place, sir, with regard to Sudha Murthy. She recently gave an interview where she said that she carries vegetarian food with her everywhere, especially when she goes abroad, because she's scared that, the utensils over there are probably used by restaurants that are not pure vegetarian. And so she said that she only looks for pure vegetarian restaurants and she only likes to have vegetarian food, and non-vegetarian food is not good. So a lot of people said that cultural vegetarianism in India roots from the disgust of animals and not the divinity of them. So there is this secular country, identity that we've been given. And under this, should we prevent cow slaughter and the eating of beef then?
Okay. So let me try and step back. I think, first of all, if you're talking about a society, you're talking about freedom, then surely Sudha Murthy has the freedom to eat what she wants and carry the spoons. And then nobody has any business saying what she should eat or what she should not eat. So as far as Sudha Murthy is concerned, I think this is really ridiculous that they're making a storm out of this whole thing. And again, I think there are vested interests who've got all kinds of angles which they want to use with this and try and use it as a stick to beat Brahmanism again. But I would come back again and say that every society has taboos. Okay? Our society has a taboo on cow slaughter. Okay? And that is because of various reasons. As I mentioned earlier, we looked at cattle as a sign of our wealth. We looked at cows as something which, gave our children milk and allowed them to grow up. There was a sentimental attachment. We worshipped Kamadhenu. So there's a taboo against cow slaughter in India. Now you go to the Islamic society. They have a taboo against pork for a variety of other reasons. Now, lest we just say, okay, Western society is above all these taboos and nothing happens there. they have a taboo about dog meat. Okay. And they say, how can you kill a dog and eat a dog? And I remember there was this whole, when the Korean, there was an Olympics at Seoul, there was a big drama about, how can you eat dog meat? So that's a taboo which they had. And if you look at the Chinese and the Sinic societies, they have a different philosophy altogether, which is that anything which creeps and crawls is edible as far as they're concerned. Now, each society has grown in a particular way and has certain taboos. Okay. Now, it is important to respect the taboos in those societies. I mean, there's nothing wrong in that. You respect the dominant feeling in that society. It's a matter of giving respect. And I mean, that respect, when you give, people pay back that respect 10 times over. And it's there in every society. So, I mean, to come and pick out Hindu society, oh, Hindu society, there, cow, holy cow. You can say holy dog. Okay, but that doesn't really, that's not the issue. The issue is really that every society has certain taboos, and those taboos have to be respected and honored. And as simple as that. And you can get after Sudha Murthy, but I think what Sudha Murthy did, I mean, you can't talk about democracy and freedom and the human spirit has his ability to do what you want, and then say, no, she cannot do that. That's ridiculous.
Just an extension to that question, sir. Oftentimes, when we interpret this particular question in colleges and institutions, we are told, and this was something that my teacher told me, and I don't know why I just couldn't agree with it, that there is an innate disgust we have with animals, and that's why we choose not to eat them, which I don't agree with. So if you could elucidate that, and secondly, they say that the word pure vegetarian means that everything else or anyone who eats anything else is impure and an animal is impure. So these seem to be very weak and very vicious arguments that seem to be doing the rounds of educational institutions in the country.
I do not know where this concept of pure vegetarian must have come after the English language came, because earlier there was nothing called, nobody talked about pure or vegetarian. People have different traditions. Even in India, there are people who do not eat meat. There are other society people, the Kshatriyas used to eat meat, and it was considered important for them. So, I mean, I don't understand where this whole issue comes about disgust for animals. I think if you look at Hindu society, it is one of the probably only societies where we say that man is not just the apex species, and everything else is meant for his uh, what is the right word to use, meant for either for his eating or for his exploitation. Now, another matter that some of these things have fallen by the wayside after all those invasions, but we have believed that every species has a right to coexist with us. Even today, when I go for a walk in the park, I see people bringing, grains and feeding the squirrels. Somebody is feeding ants also. So that is part of our innate, DNA, that you have respect for every creature on this planet. Every creature has a role to play in this planet, and we have a, obligation to look after these species. They are not meant for our edification. They are there because they fulfill a role, a niche in our society. So, and I don't see this whole business about pure and impure and all that. I think these are all words which are, you want to beat somebody up, you can use all these words. But nobody has said pure vegetarian or impure non-vegetarian. Nobody said that. These are things, again, you're creating conflicts when none need to exist.
Very true. In the larger context, since the advent of artificial intelligence and genetic re-engineering, how relevant is Hinduism?
Okay, that's really a very brilliant question. And I think way I would answer that question is that society evolves, technology evolves, technologies change. Now, of course, in a cyclical world, they go up and they come down, but that's a separate issue. But fundamentally, if I look at it, every religion has to be relevant and has to reinvent itself at all periods of time. And I think it falls onto all of us to reinterpret Hinduism during a period of artificial intelligence. Now, the advantage we have is that we are not bound to a book at a particular point in time in a particular phase of society. We have we have Shruti, we have Smriti, which is, different interpretations which come at different points in time. And we have the ability and flexibility to really evolve as time goes on. So I don't have an answer today, and I don't think anybody really has an answer. They talk about consciousness, they talk about other areas, but I think as a society, every religion will have to reinvent itself during a period of artificial intelligence. The religions which reinvent themselves and create a compelling narrative are those which will survive. Those which do not create that compelling narrative and try and stick to a story which was created some couple of thousand years ago and try and flog that story in a different context, they will have challenges. So it is to all of us today who have it's not just about looking at the past, it's also about recreating and reinventing the future, and all of us have to play that role. The scholars in our society, people have to do that. And what I feel very confident about is that every time in our society, whenever we've had a challenge, whenever we have had a crisis, somebody has sprung up from the soil and reinvented that. If you look back at one point in time, Hinduism, after Buddhism had come up, the whole Vedic part of our society had really sort of got undermined. Adi Shankara came and he reinvented Advaita, and it coexisted with Buddhism, but it came. Similarly, then we had the Islamic revolutions and invasions which came into our country. We had the Bhakti movement. The Bhakti movement again tried to reinterpret Hinduism during that period in time. Finally, when the British came, and again a narrative was trying to be created, Swami Vivekananda came and he reinvented the sense, or not really reinvented, but represented what Sanatan Dharma Yoga, Hinduism, whatever name you want to call it, did. So I'm sure and I'm confident that during this crisis again, that will happen, because that is our DNA. That is who we are.
Very well, sir. That brings me to the end of my question bank, and I would open the floor to all the viewers.
Okay, that was quite interesting and level-headed. Like, what I particularly liked was your remark that the world has always existed. You see, in Hindu scriptures, and there are many, there are also many creation stories, but they're really just stories. Because in Sankhya philosophy, for example, you have this very explicit principle that both nature and consciousness are eternal, and they're co-eternal. The one does not issue from the other, like in Vedanta, where matter is conceived as the matter state of spirit. No, here you see matter and spirit are two distinct entities, and they're both aja, unborn. And so that is, you see, many Hindus say, oh, Hinduism is scientific, but, they don't live up to it. They still entertain a lot of superstitions and so on. Whereas if you really go to the heart of Hindu tradition, you could really say this is scientific. And so the insight that the world is uncreated is true to the scientific principle of the permanence of the total sum of mass energy, right? So nothing is created, nothing disappears. Things can be transformed, but they don't disappear. And so I merely wanted to compliment you on that very correct insight, or rather you could say I want to compliment Hinduism on that very correct insight.
Yeah, yes. It is our amanat, our treasure.
Mm-hmm.
Preserve and protect.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my question is regarding the, I think, caste system, which just pointed out. Sorry, I'm forgetting his name. My bad. So my question is that whenever somebody, I too agree to that point that this caste system was basically in Hinduism was based on the action and the quality a person has, not based on the birth. But whoever wants to lower it, they quote the Manusmriti. That in Manusmriti, and I also verified in Manusmriti, it is actually written that there are things based on the birth, and there are things on the treatment of women. So I want to understand this Manusmriti, the controversy around the Manusmriti, and what is the relevance of Manusmriti in Hindu Dharma, if it is not going beyond context.
Okay, no, it's a very interesting question. So you talked about Manusmriti, talking loosely about women, but there's a part in Manusmriti where they say that where the women are not looked after, that society decays, or something to that effect. I don't have the exact words. So there are also things which are interposed. People put in things in various places. But for a moment, let us assume that what Manu said about the caste were actually what attributed to him. So one of the great things which Bhagwan Krishna did in the Bhagavad Gita was that when he gave his whole entire sermon and shiksha to Arjun, he also said, you have the option now. I have told you. Now it is up to you to decide what you wish to do. So just because Manu has said something, assuming that it is true, does not mean that we have to follow it for all time and all purpose. And there are so many commentators, each of whom have given very different stories. So you can pick and choose. Like I said, I talked about the story of Kanaka. I talked about the story of, Utanka. So there are many other counter stories which are there. So it's a question of, are we going to be bound by what Manu said? And if I look back in another sense, Manu was a constitution giver. And during every period of time, somebody has been, in our society is not one Manu. Manus evolve over a period of time. Just like I spoke about the earlier story about many Rams and many Hanumans, Manus also come. And I would say that if you look at Ambedkar, who's given us the constitution, he's also a Manu in some kind. So I don't think we should get into this. Yeah, Manusmriti mein ye likha tha, kisne likha, kab likha, kya malum hai. So I think if I look at it in a broader perspective, Bhagwan has given us the buddhi to choose what we wish to do as we go forward. And Krishna has himself said, use your viveka. Vivek means really the ability to discriminate between dharma and adharma. And merely because somebody has said or is purported to have said something does not mean that we have to follow it for all time to come. And we have the ability to make our decisions. I hope that answers your question. At least that's my perspective and where I come from.
We have a question by Vikas Ji. He has said that do Hindus, Jains, and Buddhists and all other groups like Banvasis have the same view of dharma?
So I think broadly, I would say yes. Although everybody comes with, the beauty of the dharmic philosophy is that you can have different sampradaya, which means that each of them has a slightly different perspective or a worldview. And that's why and people whom they sort of, there's a lineage or a spiritual guru is attached with that. But I would say that broadly, this is what we would say would be common. And the best way I describe dharma is an open architecture. If you're a computer guy, there's an open architecture and there's a proprietary architecture. So the dharmic framework is an open architecture where people who come from different sampradayams build on that foundation, but have slightly different perspectives. And it is all right. We can coexist with each of these different perspectives and learn from each other. So that is very important. So probably if you look at each of these groups, even within the groups, different people will have slightly different perspectives on the whole thing. So, nobody has a hard and fast sort of, this is narrow perspective, this is the way, my way or highway. So in that sense, I believe that, dharma framework offers the best opportunity for people to coexist with slightly different worldviews.
Vikas ji asks that if there are slightly different views, then what ties us together commonly?
Oh, good question. So, first of all, I think, and this is a very interesting question, and people raise it in a different way, where they say that, yeah, India was never a country till the British came and united us and made it into a politically, single unit. Now, I will step back in history and say that there never was a time when India was not considered a civilizational entity. And if you look at all our, epics, for example, you look at the Mahabharata. I'm just giving an example. You had Gandhari coming from Gandhara in Afghanistan. You had Panchali or Draupadi coming from Panchala, Kashmir. You had Hastinapur, which is Delhi, where I'm sitting in Gurugram today. That is seat of Dronacharya. And you had multiple sort of regions all integrated into the framework. Similarly, if you look at Ramayana, you have right from Rameshwaram to Hampi, where Hanuman was supposed to come from, right up to the north, Ayodhya. So India as a civilizational entity has existed all the time. You look at Shakti Peeth, where the body of Shakti was cut into, Sati was cut into 51 pieces. And those 51 pieces landed in all parts of India, from Kamakya to the west to somewhere else. But all that happened. It did not, the body part did not fall in Burma or in Yugoslavia or, whatever the country is today, called Serbia, but it fell in the subcontinent. So in that sense, all our stories really bring us together. But you come to a very important point that this is something which cannot never be taken for granted. One has to work on it all the time. By strengthening Dharma Yoga, number one, you are strengthening and building the glue for this civilization. But if Dharma Yoga weakens, then obviously the society will also fragment much more. We have seen what's happened with that part of our subcontinent, which is today Pakistan. Our entire civilization, there was a home. You talked about our ancient civilization. A lot of our history is attached to that part of the world. But all that is today gone. That is now an empty shell. So you're absolutely right. Unless we integrate, and the beauty of our civilization has been the word syncretism. We have said that you can have your perspective, I can have my perspective. Let's learn the best from each other and let's try and find common ground. And that is the reason why India has remained as a civilizational entity, and it will remain a civilizational entity till we keep looking for that common ground, and not say that my sampradayam becomes larger than the whole, which is the dharmic framework. So it is something which is always needs to be a work in progress. It's something which all of us have to commit to doing. Otherwise, it's very easy. It's very tough to build something. It takes generations to build something, but it is very easy to fragment it and to break it into pieces. So that's really my long answer to your question.
Thank you, and thank you, Ravi sir, for explaining my question on the Manusmriti. So what I understood is that there is not much relevance when there are more important texts like Bhagavad Gita, where Lord Krishna has explained it to be taken by the work and action. My question is on to the Bhagavad Gita. There has been lots of commentaries by different authors, like this from this one, from Chinmayananda, and so on. So which one should we try to get now?
This is a very difficult question because each person brings his own perspective. The ISKCON perspective is slightly different from Swami Chinmayananda's perspective. So I would say that, at the end of the day, each one of us has to build our own sort of interpretation. And, you take what these commentators have said and build your own Bhagavad Gita in your mind. Now, it might seem a little difficult. It might seem a little challenging, but use these as, they are all, I would say, smriti at the end of the day, which is commentaries from people. Now, I find Swami Chinmayananda's commentary very enlightening. I've also have, is the ISKCON book with us. So I would say, 90%, a lot of them are very similar. There's a 5% nuance here and there. It doesn't matter which one you pick up. What matters is you read the book. And I think when you've done that, you got 90%. Put your little interpretation for 5%. It's not so relevant which one of these people you pick up. I think Swami Chinmayananda is also very, his book is also very inspiring. I'm inspired when I read any of these books. And, it's an interesting thing today when we are talking about it. There's this film which is coming on Oppenheimer. And Oppenheimer himself used to read the Bhagavad Gita and was very inspired by it. So in a sense, I don't think who's the author becomes very important. I think it's what really inspires you and what you find connects with you. And individuals will have different views. I'm sorry, I can't give you a direct one. It's easy for me to say, Swami Chinmayananda or ISKCON. But I think finally, at the end of the day, it's a personal thing. What resonates with you, sir?
I think the takeaway from that is that learn Sanskrit and read Dharma Yoga, which is Ravi Swaminathan and Anantji's book. Thank you very much, sir, for that very insightful talk. And I thank you and Koinad Elstree for joining us today. Thank you. Namaste.